Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Making the Argument. Today, we're going to have an important discussion about the concept of foreign policy. Specifically, what does an American first foreign policy look like? There's been a lot of discussion about domestic policy, about taxes, about regulations. You see all the work the Doge is doing. All of it been very good, very important. You've seen it about with immigration. But when it comes to foreign policy, much of U.S. foreign policy has been dictated by what we oftentimes call the post-World War II consensus. And a lot of that was based around the idea of trying to prevent another world war, trying to prevent nuclear war, trying to prevent the rise of communism, totalitarianism or authoritarianism in all of its various forms. And that led to certain alliances, NATO, the Warsaw Pact. And after the Warsaw Pact fell, entering and navigating through this new world with the United States as the world's lone global hegemon with the rise of China and other issues. But that post-World War II consensus seems to have dictated most of the United States' foreign policy objectives and operations for quite some time. And now it appears to be, we'll just say, either being heavily reformed or potentially even ended. And I recently read an article by a gentleman named David Brogg, and he laid out what I thought was one of the most concise and comprehensive arguments I've seen for trying to articulate a concrete example of what an American first foreign policy should look like going forward. And that is what we're going to analyze today. As always, I'm your host, Nick Freitas, and I'll read off some of my credentials right here just so you understand that maybe I know a little bit about foreign policy, just a tad. So not only have I worked in a state legislature, but before that, I also did 11 years active duty in the military, to include a couple of combat tours with 1st Special Forces Group. So I got a bit of a background in unconventional warfare, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, things of that nature. And I'll be relying on some of that to kind of, analyze what David had to say, see if I agree based off of some of the experiences I've had. With me in the studio, my beautiful bride, Tina, Queen of the Bees.
Hello, everyone.
And then, of course, we have our resident historian, political prognosticator, the Oracle of Virginia, Christian Hines. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well.
All right. Well, we've got the article up there, so we're going to jump right into it. And this is like one page, so it's not very long. What really impressed me about it was how much he was able to do in a relatively short amount of space. So again, from David Brogg, written May 13th. This is very, very recent in the American Conservative. Almost everyone in the MAGA movement wants President Donald Trump to pursue an American first foreign policy. The only problem is we haven't even begun to define what that means. Diehard MAGA leaders and voters differ, often intensely, on what an American first foreign policy should look like as applied to each major conflict zone across the globe. At present, American First is a completely reactive movement. We are united only by our opposition to neoconservative overreach. We're unanimous in our commitment to never repeat the twin tragedies of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Ask any one of us, and we'll tell you the same cautionary tale. In a moment of geopolitical hubris, we paid a steep price in American blood and treasure to remake the Middle East, and we have nothing to show for it. The Taliban rules Afghanistan today just as it did before our invasion. Iraq has been transformed from a strong counterweight to Iranian ambition into a de facto Iranian ally. Knowing what you're against is a start, but to govern, we must transform American first from a reaction to past events into a prescription for present policy. This will take hard work and extensive deliberation before we can even begin debating specific policies. We must first agree upon the core principles that should undergird these policies. There are 4 basic principles that should inform an American first foreign policy going forward. Okay, so right off the bat, when you consider his preamble, what's your take on it?
I think that it's off to a good start.
Yeah.
Look, part of the reason that we've gotten to this point is, as this article pointed out, and as other people, Donald Trump in particular, has pointed out, is that we've spent arguably trillions of dollars doing nation building, policing the world, making the world safe for democracy. And by the way, we haven't been doing that since 9/11. We've been doing that since Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah.
And what exactly do we have to show for it? It's hard to find that a lot of, from my standpoint, it's hard to find American foreign policy since 1917 has actually really been in the interests of the United States rather than in the interests of a specific ideology, in this case, liberalism and democracy. And when I say foreign policy, I don't mean that like, well, okay, the Japanese attack us in Pearl Harbor, so of course we go to war because we were attacked. I mean, when we're the ones setting the policy, not when we're reacting to, again, being attacked by a foreign power. So setting aside the conflict of World War II for a minute, when I look at World War I, when I look at certain actions that we took during the Cold War, and when I especially look at most of what's happened since 1991, I can't really find a lot of examples of things where I'm like, yep, that was absolutely in our interest and we benefited from that action that was taken.
Did you want to add anything to that before I
No. The only thing I was going to say is I felt like the assessment was pretty good, that we're basically all over the place, our side of the spectrum. There are people that think after 9/11, we should have invaded Iraq and Afghanistan and all that. And then there are people that think that 9/11 was a government undercover job. Yeah. And that it was just because they wanted to go to war that they did that. So we've got a pretty wide swath of opinions with relation to that. And some of us are non-interventionists and some of us are not. And we've got some really different views.
I think he's right with respect to the whole, when he talks about the neoconservative overreach. I really do think when we talk about neoconservative foreign policy, that almost is what Christian described as not just kind of the post-World War II consensus, but kind of the Wilson consensus, that the primary, or that one of the primary objectives of the United States and the United States military is to make the world, quote, safe for democracy, right? That was the Wilsonian kind of concept here. And you see that formulating after World War I. World War II, and now I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate here. I mean, obviously in World War II, and you mentioned this, we were attacked by Japan. Now, part of the reason why we were attacked is because we had a foreign policy that was seeking to intervene to some degree thwart what Japan was able to do with respect to imperial expansion. And I think, look, I think we should have fought World War II, right? I think we should have fought World War II. I think that Nazism was certainly something, and imperial Japanese expansion was something that was worth fighting. By the same token, I think we do have to do an assessment of what it meant for communism and how that war ended and what sort of status quo was left in place. And a lot of it, too, being kind of the psychological component of that we now have this knee-jerk reaction that we all understand, and appropriately so, that Nazism bad, Nazism evil. Totally agree with that. But for some strange reason, we don't have the same hostility toward communism, at least not throughout the West in the way that I think that we should. So that has to be taken into account. What sort of actions did we take? How did our foreign policy engage with that? Now, I also think that a lot of our foreign policy decisions were actually made to counter communism. So when you look at the Korean War, when you look at Vietnam, when you look at our involvement in Afghanistan with the Mujahideen against the Soviets, when you look at a variety of other U.S. foreign policy, both from a financial standpoint, from work that we might see within the covert and clandestine operations, a lot of it was there to attempt to thwart communism without engaging in full-blown war. I think it's also important, if we're being intellectually honest here, we went through World War I, thought it was the war to end all wars. Very shortly after that, we went into a war that was even more brutal and took more life. And then when it ended with the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and shortly after that, the expansion of nuclear powers to include the Soviet Union, I completely understand why people were concerned with respect to a third world war being the one that would potentially wipe out civilization. When you're talking about harnessing nuclear power, that changes the dynamic in a way that nobody throughout world history had ever had to contend with before. And so I think it's appropriate to have a little bit of sympathy for the people that were making some of these decisions and deciding what role the various superpowers would play. However, the foreign policy decisions that I have the most problems with, maybe surprising to some, are not the ones that were made during the Cold War, or not the ones that were necessarily made during World War II, although I do think that we should reevaluate some of those and decide what could have been better and more appropriate courses of action. But definitely when I look at the response to the attacks on 9/11, I do think going into Afghanistan was justified. I don't think the way that we ultimately ended up trying to conduct operations over there made sense. I said relatively early on, I can say this because I didn't just say it, 20 years after the fact. I think we should have kept our operations in Afghanistan to special operations, air power, and working with the Northern Alliance and indigenous forces in order to try to set up some sort of regime over there that would have made sense with the culture and the history and the terrain and the various tribal considerations. I would not have gone into Iraq. Now, early on, I said we should have, right? Because I'm a young 25-year-old, Green Beret
to go to war.
who want to get in the fight, right? And we needed to exact some punishment for what happened on 9/11. But when I look back at it now, a little bit more experienced, a little bit wiser, a little bit more in tune with historical precedent, I don't think I don't think the invasion of Iraq was a good idea.
I also think that we also have one thing about America First foreign policy is I don't think we have any business nation building. We have no business going to another country and setting up a government. If a country attacks us, we should be wiping them completely off the map and not setting up a new government for them. They can live with their choices.
You know why we did that?
I understand, but I kind of feel like there doesn't seem to be any ramifications long term for some of these countries that prop up terrorism as a method for doing what they want to do. If they had to live with the consequences of their actions, we might not have ever been attacked.
So, Tina, you know why we really got into nation building was because look at what happened at the end of World War II.
Yeah.
Like,
two of the nations that we
did
two major
building.
powers. We did nation building, and arguably we did it successfully. Arguably the nation building that took place. Arguably, the nation building that took place in Japan was highly successful. Arguably, the nation building that took place in Western Germany, to the extent that it did, was successful. And so again, this is the part where I think we should be a little bit sympathetic to some of the decisions that were made when people looked at various changes like this and thought, okay, well, hey, this was possible. Because now Germany, you can claim, well, there's kind of a shared cultural heritage. We have a great deal of German immigrants. There's there was some degree of shared culture and values, which didn't make setting up a democratic system with a relatively free market, an impossible task in a place like Germany. But then again, you can look at Japan and say, okay, well, Japan, just a couple 100 years ago was essentially a Bushido, feudal culture and then an imperial one. But it still managed to adopt what we would call certain concepts of Western values and classical liberalism and implement them to great effect and to be very, very clearly in the America's sphere of orbit as opposed to the Soviets post-World War II. So again, you can look at some of these attempts and say, okay, well, did those have long-term benefits? Why can't we? I think the
big
problem
difference is the amount of time we spend. Like, it's crazy to me that we were able to complete that mission so much quicker than propping up and putting a new government into place in Iraq and Afghanistan, which, by the way, was a total failure.
So
what made that a failure and what made World War II a success?
I think significant cultural issues. So for instance, in Japan, we had so thoroughly defeated them and deprived them of any sort of military capacity that we were in a position to set terms. Plus, you had the threat of the Soviet Union right on their doorstep. And so there was a high degree of incentive to cooperate with the United States. I would also argue that as strange as this might sound, looking at the entire history of Japan, the recent history of Japan, I think, put them in a position to where they were able to adopt certain principles and concepts and to use them to great effect in a way that you might not have anticipated if you were kind of looking at Japanese history before World War II. With Germany, it was a little bit easier because a lot of the ideas and concepts which have informed Western liberal democracy, and I say that in the classical sense, were some of those originated within Germany. When it comes to the Middle East, now you're talking about a very, very different culture. You're also talking about a religious component to that culture that is in many respects, I believe in many respects, somewhat antithetical to the whole concept of democratic systems or processes.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
Okay. My question is this. So there are two things. One is the cultures are very different on their side of it, but our culture is also really different now than it was back then. I think we had the stomach to win wars back then. And now we're contending with people in our own country who like refuse to let us try to win a war.
This is also different.
We have a huge swath that are like, everything has to be humanitarian efforts, and we treat every other country as if they're being held hostage too by whatever powers that be. I mean,
no, I agree. That's why I said there's a very big difference. A lot of the people within the Middle East did not see. They don't see like, radical Islam or jihadism as a threat to their culture. They don't see it. They didn't have some outside external threat that they saw as a threat to their overall culture. There's nothing that they're looking at with respect to their own tribal traditions or their own history or their religion, which lends itself to what we would call Western liberal democracy. And so when you're trying to incorporate all these things, and they don't necessarily see a reason to do so, and is instead being viewed as something that's imposed by a Western power, which they have significant problems with theologically and culturally, I don't think it's a shock to do the math and realize, hey, this doesn't add up.
Yeah, but the Japanese didn't like it either. I mean, there was a fairly religious component to their culture as well. I don't know if I guess it wouldn't be the same type of thing.
Not the same at all.
I wanted to say that there is another massive difference between how we handled Japan and how we handled Afghanistan. And I think the use of a nuclear weapon on Japan probably had a massive impact on how they responded to our efforts afterwards.
Well, no, that's why I said
right. But we didn't do that in Afghanistan. That's a huge difference.
I get it. That's why I said one of the first things I mentioned was we so totally defeated Japan in World War II that essentially the militarists within Japan had been utterly defeated, utterly wiped out.
Same thing in Germany.
Yeah, same thing in Germany. I mean, and it was, and again, we came in and argued to some degree that we did it so effectively that in many respects, for generations, they kind of lacked any sort of martial spirit whatsoever. The Germans in part because there was a certain degree of shame associated with both Nazism and the Holocaust. The Japanese didn't necessarily share the same shame with respect to, like, say, the raping of Nanking or expansionism, but it was this idea that they had been totally defeated.
They established a very strong pacifist culture in Japan after World War II. Because of and it's still around today. Like Japan, it's the irony is that we want Japan to remilitarize in many respects, but the Japanese themselves don't want to.
You're starting to see that change.
There's a huge amount of shame in Germany to the point where they don't even want to talk about what happened.
Well, what's interesting too is
they don't even want to have a country. That's their problem.
J.D. Vance pointed this out when he gave his Munich Security Conference speech, where he was basically saying it's like all of the values and shared history and values which used to create populations that were proud of their country and therefore willing to fight for it. This was the most important thing J.D. Vance said there, and people didn't pick up on it. He's like, you want to talk about this great looming threat of Putin and the Russians. Here's the real question. Do you have populations that are actually willing to fight them? They're certainly willing to send over U.S. money. They're certainly willing to send over equipment. But do you have populations willing to fight it? Because a significant portion of the population in Germany, when polled, says, no, I would not fight for my country. If you have a population of that size that will not fight for your country, it's arguable whether or not you even have a country. But anyways, going back to this, the only reason why I wanted to have more of an in-depth discussion about the history of the last 100 years is because I think we need to properly understand that it's not that all of these decisions or all of these organizations, whether it be the United Nations or the League of Nations or NATO or everything, were set up with this idea of it was just a bunch of globalists that wanted to rule the world. Right. There were very real considerations that made a lot of sense for some of these decisions. The fair question is, do they still make sense? Okay, let's go in. So he mentioned 4 concepts that he was going to use, 4 principles for which we would kind of establish like a series of guidelines, a coherent strategy for determining what would be an America first approach to a particular problem set. So think of it this way. You have a refugee crisis. You have a trade crisis. You have a terrorist attack. You have a war. You have a regional crisis with respect to strategic resources. How does America First handle that question? We know how the post-World War II consensus handles that question. How does the America First? He goes, first, American interests are the only consideration. There is one and only one criterion upon which to base American foreign policy: American interest. We must reject the abstract rationales that have been invoked to support prior interventions, such as preserving the rules-based international order, spreading democracy, and meeting our, quote, responsibility to protect. Such concepts may sometimes intersect with our direct national interests, but they do not define them. Simply put, any deployment of American troops or treasure abroad must pass the grieving mother test. Can you tell the mother of a fallen soldier that her child gave his or her life to keep their family safe and free? The more difficult it would be to make this case, the more likely the deployment is a mistake. I got to tell you, when I first started reading this, the first part of it where he says the rules-based international order, that could be another way we would describe the post-World War II consensus, spreading democracy and meeting a responsibility to protect. Such concepts at first I was like, okay, I don't want to throw everything out. When we talk about the responsibility to protect, again, there was a reason why everybody kind of allowed the United States to be the dominant military hegemon when it came to conflicts. And part of it was because they were trying to keep Europe from constantly engaging in wars with one another, because it had become really, really difficult for them to be able to maintain a balance, to successfully maintain a balance of power before, in order to prevent wars. Okay. So the fact that we were the dominant one was important, right? That was the reason for that. However, the second part of this, just makes absolute sense to me. Such concepts may sometimes intersect with our direct national interests, but they do not define them. I love that, because he's saying, look, I'm not throwing all this stuff out as if it never makes sense, or it's always bad, or it was always stupid, or it's always ridiculous, or it's just these no longer get to define when the United States gets involved. If it so happens that these things coincide with other American interests, great. But we're no longer going to put our interests second place for these purposes. And then now I will say this, when it comes to can you tell the mother of a fallen soldier that her child gave his or her life to keep their family safe and free, the more difficult it will be to make this case, the more likely the deployment is a mistake. That's an interesting one. It's a little bit subjective. But I get where he's going with it, right? Because again, when we're talking about principles, a lot of times principles are not just a hard and fast, rule that explains every single nuance. And so what he's doing is he's adding a component, he's adding a human component into this as a test. Now, obviously, you're not going to be able to try convincing any mother, right, that it was worth her son's life or her daughter's life. That's a tall order. That's a tall order, right? Even if you're dedicated. But it does speak to this idea that there was a time where families understood that this is an unfortunate reality of preserving a free state, is that there will be times where you have to go to war. There will be times you have to sacrifice. The question is the majority of people who lose a son or a daughter to a conflict, can they at least have some peace knowing that their child fought and died for something that was worth sacrificing for? Man, I think that's a really good question. A really good question. And not one to be thrown up, I don't want to hear the eternal pacifist saying, well, that nothing meets that litmus test. You're a moron. There are some things that meet that litmus test. And I say this not only as somebody who served, I say this as somebody with a son that is currently going through infantry basic training, right? He's joining the portion of the military where they send you to close with and kill the enemy. And I didn't raise him to believe that there's nothing worth dying for, because what a pathetic existence. So, but I really like this first principle that he's laid out. Any idea?
I don't have much disagreements with his first principle here. In fact, I think that this is kind of the heart of what realpolitik is and what America First is as a concept. It's worth noting that safe and free might be kind of too subjective of a term.
Yeah.
And in terms of that test that he puts forward at the end of this paragraph, but broad strokes, it's hard to disagree that, look, if you're going to criticize, the post-war and post-Cold War order, then what are you replacing that with, right? Yeah. And I do think that some form of realpolitik is ultimately what's going to is what's going to replace it. And you're seeing evidence of that right now in Trump's administration. Like, I mean, Trump went to Saudi Arabia not too long ago, where he basically told people, like, the nation builders kind of wrecked more nations than they built. And he was actually praising the Saudis for, you guys are building all this stuff and you're not really using foreign aid to do it. You're using your own money to do it. And we want more countries in the world operating on that mindset rather than what can we get out of the United States. Yeah. So look, you're going to always have a balancing act between, moral concerns and realpolitik. The British had this at the height of the British Empire. Like in the 1880s, for example, and 1890s, you had a huge debate within the British Parliament over what to do with the Eastern Question, which dealt with the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. And the Eastern Question was basically that the Ottoman Empire was starting to fall apart. You had the Russians that were coming in wanting land grabs. You had the Germans that were investing resources to try to build influence within that area. And so traditionally, British foreign policy was prop up the Ottoman Empire as a bulwark against the Russians. We don't want them to have access to the Mediterranean. We don't want them to take the Straits. So we're going to support the Ottomans against the Russians. Well, the Ottomans were massacring Christians, right? The Ottomans were an Islamic state that were oppressing Catholic and Orthodox Christians in the Middle East and in the Balkans. And so you had Christian voices within the British Parliament that were saying, why are we shipping weapons to Muslim fanatics that are killing Armenians? That doesn't make a lot of sense morally. And then you had a realpolitik side that was saying, so your alternative is to allow our greatest geopolitical ally total domination of the Balkans because you're concerned about genocide in the Balkans of, Christians in Greece or in Bulgaria or in Armenia, which obviously isn't in the Balkans, but you get the point. And so obviously there's a real tension there. And you can argue one way or the other whether or not British foreign policy was correct in that time period, but like that is the type of tension that we're going to have to grapple with in the decades to come from our perspective.
Can I ask a question real quick? How much of the difference between, so basically, whether or not we're able to win a war defeat an adversary to the extent where nation building actually works, is part of that because of the difference between how men and women look at things? And I'm only asking that because we have most of the Western societies now are very feminized, and we've got much weaker men. If men are at the helm, they're much weaker men, usually, except for Trump. We've got all these weak men kind of steering the ship. And so much of this pacifist thing is a very feminine idea. And do you think that matriarchal sort of influences have wrecked that for us?
What's interesting is that there's been a lot of studies on whether or not you're more likely or less likely to go to war or engage in conflict based off of male or female leadership. And I will say female leadership does not necessarily indicate a more peaceful.
And that's not what I meant. I meant the method for
This is what I'm trying to explain. It's important to make a distinction, right? Because the easy rebuttal is going to be like, well, when women are in charge, that doesn't mean you go to less wars, right? Okay, acknowledged it, but there's a difference between feminine impulses when it comes to conducting those wars, the aftermath of those wars, aid. There's also an influence with respect to preventing harm. When preventing harm is one of your primary considerations, that obviously makes the full conduct of absolute warfare much more difficult.
Yeah, because your knee-jerk reaction is the idea of there are things worth dying for. And that's a sort of masculine way to look at it. As the mom of Luke, I see it differently.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think anything's worth my little boy's life, right? And it's just a difference in how men see things or mothers see things versus a man's perspective.
No, I think there's something to be said for feminine impulses with respect to, things like foreign policy, foreign aid. Why are we doing things? I think there's also something when Christian talks about the differences between what we might call realpolitik, which is just understanding the world is the way it is, and there's certain considerations you have to take into consideration, versus moral implications. And the thing is that some people, and anybody that tries to act like it is a purely either or proposition, I don't think understands the game. Because if you are saying that is wrong, therefore we must involve ourselves militarily, or therefore we must invade, or therefore we must, well, you're going to find yourself in an endless struggle where in many cases your intentions may be good, but you're going to cause more harm because you don't properly understand the problem. I think that is a good definition of a lot of American foreign policy decisions. By the same token, if everything is just moralless realpolitik, what I find to be convenient in the moment, you're also probably going to engage in relationships where now people don't trust you. People don't, they know that it's all about power, or it's all about your interest at the expense of theirs. And so there's a balancing act. There's a balancing act. And I think he's acknowledging this in this first principle. He's acknowledging that there is a balancing act. Our interests have to be paramount. However, a just and moral outcome can also be a component of our interests. I want to move on to the second point here. America has interests beyond our borders. I think this next part is a direct shot at what we might call the isolationist tendency. Now, there are some people that would say, just because I don't want to go to war all the time doesn't mean I'm an isolationist. Agreed. But there are people that have isolationist tendencies. I'm sorry, but I have seen people that, well, I don't see where we got to trade with anybody. We shouldn't have, any immigration. Why do we? They literally want to throw up the walls and nobody goes in, nobody goes out, and we can do everything ourselves. And
we go full autarky.
Yeah, and it's like, okay.
The funny thing is that there's a bit of nuance on this front, but how about you read us through his argument first?
Let's read through the argument. Okay.
And then we'll argue over it.
All right. So America has interests beyond our borders. Even if we narrowly limit our focus to American interests, we cannot disregard or disengage from the world beyond our borders. Yes, Washington and Jefferson urged us to avoid entangling foreign alliances, and John Quincy Adams warned us not to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. But such cautions against foreign overreach never stopped our founders from casting a wary eye abroad. From the quasi-war against France in 1798 to the First and Second Barbary Wars against the pirates of Tripoli and Algiers, 1801 and 1815, to the War of 1812 against Great Britain, our founders did not hesitate to recognize and confront foreign threats. Just because these threats have been exaggerated in the past doesn't mean they've disappeared in the present. I think that is now the one example that he provides there that I'm not is I don't think illustrates his point as well as the War of 1812. When the Brits come and burn down the White House, it's like, you got to fight, right? But they
were also stealing our citizens,
yes,
and impressing them into the Royal Navy.
Yeah. Well, and with the Barbary pirates too, they were attacking, American shipping in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. So I think the nuance that he's searching for right here, and keep in mind, what he's doing is he's addressing an argument of the people that are legitimately more on the isolationist, right? There's a spectrum. There's the interventionist, and then there's the isolationist, right? And then you have people that fall along that entire spectrum. The neocons were very much interventionists, right? The Pat Buchanans of the world were much more isolationist, and not just from a military perspective, right? What he's articulating here, and I think he does a good job of it, is identifying that, foreign policy or that foreign entities are going to impact your world, whether it be through trade, whether it be through culture, whether it be through immigration, whether it be through war and conflict. There are strategic resources which benefit the American people and which benefit our strategic security and constitute a legitimate American interest, which fall outside our borders. And so this idea of we are still going to be involved, and in the United States, completely removing ourselves from foreign engagement and at times intervention is not necessarily in the American interest. I think that's the point he's making, is that it's this idea that you have some people who think, well, if we're involved in a foreign conflict or we're involved in a foreign engagement, that's automatically against our interest. I don't believe that's true. There are times where I think war abroad is justified. But I think he's being nuanced in the way that he approaches it. And it's saying like, look, he's acknowledging that a lot of these threats have been overblown, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. The real question is, okay, now that we've acknowledged the first principle, what is our compelling American interest, and how do we explain this to our people if we're actually going to expend blood and treasure? The next is, let's acknowledge that we are not an isolationist nation, and we're never going to be. But we need to set up the clear parameters on when is it appropriate for us to engage in overseas conflicts or battles, and when is it not?
The way that I would look at it is this. When he says that America has interests beyond our borders, I would ask to what ends, right? When I look at the Barbary Wars, it's very clear what those ends were.
Yeah.
Our shipping was being attacked by pirates, and so we sent a navy over there to deal with the pirates. Mm-hmm. It's no different than with the Houthis, right? They're launching rockets into the Red Sea, and those rockets are targeting, in some case, I can't really say our ships because we have this thing called the Jones Act, but targeting ships that are certainly doing trade with the United States, that is very much not in our interest to allow that to continue. Like we absolutely have an interest in defeating Somali pirates, the Houthis that are launching rockets into ships in the Red Sea, making sure that the Strait of Malacca's open to trade, like making sure that the free flow of commerce around the world's waterways can actually function in a way that benefits our economy. Obviously, that's a clear example of like why we should have our Navy patrol things like, the Arabian Sea or the Red Sea, even though it's on the other side of the world, because that does actually affect us. Yeah. Having the free flow of goods and trade is something that does work in our favor, for the same reason that us sending a fleet over to Northern Africa, to Algeria in the early 1800s was in our favor. But, another example is the War of 1812. So the British were, in effect, they were kidnapping our citizens and impressing them into the Royal Navy. That is a total breach in our, existence as a sovereign state. If a state can't defend its own citizens from basically slavery from another power, then that state doesn't exist, really.
Well, and I think what he does here, when he provides examples of the quasi-war, First and Second Barbary Wars, War of 1812, he's doing two things. One, he's demonstrating that even the people that said avoid tangling alliances, avoid foreign adventures, that didn't mean they meant roll over. They didn't mean that didn't mean they meant like, well, I guess we can't do shipping in the Mediterranean Sea anymore because the Barbary pirates are. It's like, no, that we had to engage, right?
But it does seem a little bit like the era of we take whatever land we want to take was over. Like we basically don't.
No, not yet.
Not at this point.
That was before the Mexican-American War.
Okay. Because my big question on it is why in the world, when another country attacks us, why aren't we defeating them to the point where we just take the land?
Because we didn't want Algeria.
We don't want Algeria.
Rather than nation build, like this is ours now. Like we're really not conquest because they attacked us.
No, that's what I'm saying. No, that is.
Tina just articulated Roman foreign policy.
Yeah, what you're advocating for is you say, why don't we just take their stuff? That's conquest. Somebody else can initiate a war with you, and you can finish it and take their stuff.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and we've done that in America, right? Like it's not like we've never done that before. And it's
I know, we just don't do it anymore.
Well, and it's not like and this is part of the kind of the post. The rules-based international order was this idea that you don't take other people's stuff through war, right? And by the way, I don't think that's a bad rule. The question is to what extent do you follow that, and are there any nuances involved?
Well, yeah, like Russia and Ukraine are having major issues with that right now.
Yeah, no, they are. But overall, I think the key point that he's making here is that America First foreign policy cannot be an isolationist foreign policy. That doesn't need, he's already articulated before, we don't need to have an overly interventionist foreign policy, and we should be wise with respect to the alliances that we join. In fact, there was a question here from Loyal to Law. He goes, does America First global policy include opting out of global organizations, like getting out of the UN, the World Health Organization, et cetera? So I got asked this at an event, and I said, look, I don't think we should be in the United Nations anymore. I'm not sure that NATO should exist in its current form. I'm not against certain alliances, but other ones, yeah, I would absolutely disengage from. So I don't think America First means you can't belong to international organizations. I do think it means you're going to be a lot more careful about why you belong to it. And it's never going to be this idea of, well, we just have to because we're the biggest player. No, if it's not in our interest, or we don't think the organization is actually doing appropriate things, or it's actively working against our interests, then we don't have to be a part of that. And we certainly don't have to subsidize it to the degree that we do the United Nations, the World Health Organization, NATO, et cetera. Now, again, I've had some people take me to task on my whole NATO comments, and I've just said, look, if I'm willing to be convinced, but right now I'm not. So you can either convince me of it or you can leave me alone, but you're not going to treat me like I don't understand the implications of being a part of NATO or not being a part of NATO. But overall, I'm pretty happy with the general principle he's laid out here. We're not an isolationist country, but neither should we be eager to intervene unless there is compelling U.S. interests. And I think the examples he's presented in early American history are good representations of us getting involved because there was a compelling U.S. interest. Any disagreement before I move on to the third point? Okay, third point. America faces limits to its ability to project power abroad. While we certainly have interests abroad, we have limited means with which to address them. An American first foreign policy requires pragmatism and prioritization. Conservatives schooled in the thought of Edmund Burke have always been skeptical of crusades to spread democracy and build nations. Burke teaches us that the best governments are those which develop organically over generations. During the French Revolution, he predicted that replacing France's century-old monarchy with a revolutionary government based on abstract ideals would spell disaster. He would have predicted the same of our failed efforts to transplant our system to the Middle East. Even when our efforts could theoretically make a difference, we face practical limits on our ability to project power abroad. Our post-9/11 wars have contributed to our unprecedented national debt. Servicing that debt now costs more than our entire defense budget. Even if we had the funds, we no longer have the industrial capacity to produce advanced munitions quickly enough to provide them in the quantities we need and our allies seek. These limitations necessitate prioritization. Just because we have an interest abroad doesn't mean we need to send our soldiers munitions or our money into the fight.
That part about Edmund Burke is so true. Yeah. For the audience that's listening or watching on YouTube, if you have not read Edmund Burke, particularly his notes on the French Revolution, go ahead and read that, because he totally deconstructs the idea that abstract principles alone and ideologies need to be the governing force of man. I mean, he warns repeatedly that, no, society needs to be organically constructed, not okay, we believe in these abstract principles and therefore we're going to guillotine people until they work. I mean, he started off
heads will roll until you like our new religion of reason.
Burke reminds me a lot. He's in some ways, Burke reminds me of he's like the English equivalent of Juan Donoso Cortez. Mm-hmm. He started off as a liberal, just like Donoso Cortez did. And then there was this revolution, in this case, the French Revolution. In Donoso Cortez's case, it was the revolutions of 1848. And that just totally changed his worldview, because he looked at the consequences of these movements. And he was like, no, this is actually making things worse. We are destroying centuries of tradition in the name of abstract ideals. And it's not like we've made society better in doing that. We've just killed a bunch of people. And we've created a suicidal, insane cult that's now launching a continental-wide war in the case of the French Revolution. Yeah, and it's really funny how you can talk about liberty, equality, and fraternity, and all that you get is bodies piling up. Yeah, and a continental-wide war that lasts 25 years. And how does it end? Oh, it just ends in another monarchy. You don't actually change. You know what they changed? Bourbons. They established. They changed. I believe that they adopted things like the decimal system. Mm-hmm. And changed.
I mean, you could look at the certain elements of the Napoleonic codes and whatnot, and I mean, again, just to be fair, there was elements that you could look at and say, okay, there was some positives there.
But Burke's point is that we get our fulfillment on a day-to-day basis, right? I don't necessarily mean this in the ultimate sense of the telos, but on a day-to-day basis, we get our fulfillment from organic bonds that we've established with our communities, with our family, with our country, and those can't be imposed through ideological force.
Yeah.
And when you try to do that, look, there's a reason that England became a liberal nation largely organically over centuries, and France tried to impose it through the guillotine. And look at the difference between those two. This is a reason why Carl Benjamin says that liberalism actually in its truest form is the English equivalent of Sharia law. It is how the Englishman lives his life. And other cultures, when you look at other cultures, talking about nation building, when you look at how the Middle East or how Africans view the English themselves, they view liberalism not as a universal thing at all. They view that as that's unique to that particular culture. And when we move into that society, we don't practice liberalism at all because that's not how we live our lives. The Pakistanis don't do liberalism. North Africans don't do liberalism because they're North African, because they're Pakistani. The English do liberalism because they're English.
This is one of the reasons why when we talked, like you talk to a lot of Green Berets and you ask us what we think of places like Afghanistan, it's like, yeah, we understand the necessity of going in and they're degrading Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. But you talk to most Green Berets and it's like, oh, are you shocked that we didn't set up an effective parliamentary democracy in Afghanistan? Like, no. Of course that wasn't going to work, right? They operate off of different tribal customs. You've got Uzbeks, you've got Tajiks, you've got Afghans, you've got concepts like Pashtunwali, right? Which are deeply, cultural considerations built into the DNA of that culture over centuries. And you're not going to show up and be like, yeah, but don't you like parliament? Like what? and so I think what David is discussing here and the fact that he's referencing Burke, this goes into that concept of kind of the realpolitik. It's this idea that even if you think something is a great idea, the concept that you're going to be able to impose that overnight, either through force or debate, or we're going to have a conversation when you don't agree, then the guillotines come out and now you will agree. It's like, I'm not saying you can't achieve some sort of success trying to do something like that. If you're willing to engage in genocide, like, are you willing to do that? Are you willing to wipe out an entire population? Are you willing to carry off their kids and completely, re-educate them in a different way? You willing to do that? If the answer is no, well, then of course Burke is correct. And by the way, the answer should be no, right? But of course Burke is correct that essentially what needs to happen is you need to allow processes to develop organically. Again, that doesn't mean you can't have certain interventions. Like one of the things the British did in India was they ended the act of when a man dies, you burn his widow at the stake, right? Or you burn his widow on the funeral pyre, right? The British came in and said, no, right? Like Cortez came in and said, yeah, the human sacrifices to the sun god end now, right? So you can't have things that you do. But it's this whole idea of, again, making the world safe for democracy. Okay, and what if they don't want it? What are you willing to do to impose it? And at what point do you say, yeah, this is no longer, not only is it no longer in our interests, it's not moral, and it's not in their interests. And so I think he's coming up with a very, very practical way to look at, okay, now that we've established when we act, we've established that there will be times that we have to act abroad. That's foreign policy. Now we have to decide, how do we prioritize this? Because we don't have the money, the power, and this is another important consideration here. Let's say you have two different ways that you can intervene, right? And both of them fit within the criteria of legitimate American interest and something that would potentially justify American involvement. Okay, can you do both with the resources that you have available? No. Okay, which one do you prioritize? There's nothing weird about this. We can have a debate over which one we should prioritize or what we should do or to what extent, but we have to have a practical debate about when does this actually make sense versus when does it not make sense. And when it really comes to projecting power abroad, you need to look good while you're doing it. And that's where true classic comes into play, because you don't want to go overseas looking fat and flabby, right? You want to wear something that actually accentuates all that American power in the arm, shoulder, and chest. And that is what True Classic does for you. Go to trueclassic.com, use my code. You're going to go in there. I'm going to tell you, I love their t-shirts, but I've actually got a shipment of button downs and polos coming in, and I can't wait to get them, because everything I've gotten through True Classic has always fit wonderfully. It feels great. It manages the heat well. It manages the various temperatures well. So I always feel confident wearing True Classic. But most importantly, you want to know why I really feel confident wearing True Classic? Because it seems like whenever I do it, my wife looks at me and goes, ooh, I like that. And let's face it, guys, that's how we decide what we're going to wear. Our wife gives us a compliment one time on a shirt we wore 4 years ago, and it's still our favorite. But with True Classic, they will continue to send you the sort of shirts that your wife will compliment you on, and you will always feel confident wearing. All right, let's get back to it. So the fourth and final principle we have here. Go ahead and scroll down.
The one that I disagree with the most.
Okay, let's go down to the fourth principle here. All right, it says, finally, America must define alliance up. The cornerstone of an American first foreign policy must be that we stop bearing the burden of our security alone and find true allies willing to take the lead in their respective regions. As we seek out allies, however, we must define alliance up. An ally is not a country willing to let us send our sons and daughters to fight shared enemies on their behalf. In an American first era, an ally is a nation willing to send their sons and daughters to fight for our shared enemies on our behalf. Allies who do the heavy lifting in service of our shared interests deserve our moral and diplomatic support. They deserve the right to buy our military products and benefit from our military technology. In limited cases, they may even be worthy of our aid. Right now, American first foreign policy is a pendulum swinging sharply away from neoconservative excesses. These four principles, okay, I'll get into that later because that's the end. So really what this principle ends with is the idea that in limited cases, they may even be worthy of our aid. So, okay, what's your potential issue with this?
Here's the issue that I've got with it. When he says that in an America First era, an ally is a nation willing to send their sons and daughters to fight our shared enemies on our behalf. If we're not willing to fight our own enemies ourselves, then they shouldn't be our enemies.
Well, he said our shared enemies.
But his point first was
but it says on our behalf.
His first point was that basically that we need to stop shouldering the burden ourselves, and then, see, okay, let me just go through it again.
Yeah.
He says, the cornerstone of an America First foreign policy must be that we stop bearing the burden of our security alone and find true allies willing to take the lead in their respective regions. As we seek out allies, however, we must define alliance up. An ally is not a country willing to let us send our sons and daughters to fight shared enemies on their behalf. In an America First era, an ally is a nation willing to send their sons and daughters to fight our shared enemies on our behalf. My whole point is that what makes somebody an ally is that we have a shared enemy, or that we have a shared interest.
Yeah.
So, for example, things have kind of blown up between us and Canada lately, but from a purely realpolitik geopolitical strategic position, Canada is kind of a natural ally of the United States.
Yeah.
We have no serious border disputes with them. We have no reason to invade them or annex them, right? They have no reason to invade or annex
shared
us.
Language.
Centuries of shared traditions and cultures with them. Now, we've talked about before that Canada might end up imploding because of some internal contradictions, and we might benefit from that. But the point is that we have no reason to invade Canada, right? We have no reason to fight Canada. We have many shared interests with Canada, and I don't mean that from an ideological perspective. I mean that like from a geopolitical perspective. And so the way that I define an ally is either we have a shared interest with them or we have a shared enemy with them. A very good example of this is Japan in many respects is actually, even though we fought a war with them 80 years ago, they're a natural ally of the United States. We have a shared interest in the context of limiting Chinese expansion.
So we have a shared enemy in that.
We have a shared enemy in that respect.
And we have shared interest with respect to trade and some other things, but yeah.
And so, but when I read that, like, okay, well, but they're not asking us to go over there and fight our enemies for them. In fact, they're willing to send their sons and daughters to fight our shared enemies. My whole point is that if we're not willing to fight an enemy, then they shouldn't be our enemy.
Well, okay, a country can be an enemy that you're not necessarily engaging in open combat with. Here's okay. I get what you're saying. First of all, let me just say I get what you're saying. I don't think another country. Again, if I don't think we should have to send our sons and daughters to fight your wars, then you shouldn't have to send your sons and daughters to fight our wars, right? Like that's the mutual agreement here. I think what he's talking about here, and the word that I would kind of zero in on here is respective regions. So I think what he's saying, the cornerstone of American First, stop bearing the burden of our security alone and find true allies willing to take. I do think we have to bear the burden of our security. But I think in the full context that he's trying to express here, and maybe he could have written it differently, right, was the idea that to the extent that we have alliances, because that's what we're talking about, then alliances are formed over shared enemies or shared interests. And I think he's looking at this more from the standpoint of insofar as conflict is necessary. So let's say that we do have a shared enemy, but the shared enemy is on your border. Okay, well, then, yeah, you should bear the burden of that responsibility. Let me give you a perfect example of this, okay? Ukraine and Russia. We have allies in NATO. Ukraine is not a NATO ally, but our allies are all very concerned about what Russia is doing. I understand why they're concerned. I absolutely do. I understand why they're concerned. However, where should the burden fall for that particular conflict? Should it fall on the United States, or should it fall on the other NATO countries for which the threat is far more imminent and present? Well, I've made this argument before. Okay, you've got more population than Russia. You've got a bigger military collectively than Russia. You've got an economy like 20 times the size of Russia collectively. Why do you need us to do the bulk of the heavy lifting in that particular conflict if you believe it really is this genuine existential threat? And I think that's what I think he's writing this in part on the backdrop of the certain conflicts that are going on right now. So you look at like Israel, for example, right? So they definitely want to buy our stuff, right? And they want to be permitted to go out and conduct operations, but they're not asking for U.S. troops. They're not asking for, U.S. stuff. Whereas more and more, now you could say, well, Ukraine's only asking for equipment
they're
as well.
asking for
equipment.
For money in the form usually of equipment, right? I mean, at the moment, I don't know the exact numbers, but I'm willing to bet at the moment, Israel and Ukraine are the two largest recipients of American foreign aid.
But the point I think that he's trying to get at here, right? And I'm not trying to pull in two conflicts as, okay, here's the example of everything that he's describing right now. I'm just saying that I think that's an example that we can look at and we can say, okay, what are you asking for? Is it a shared enemy or shared interest? Right. And then who should bear the burden of the responsibility with respect to the alliance? Because this whole part is about alliances. Insofar as we engage in alliances, we want allies that don't just look at like, okay, I'm your ally. America's got it now. Because that's kind of how it feels, right? That's kind of how it feels with NATO. That's kind of how it feels with U.S. alliances. We're not an ally. We're a sugar daddy. And we get trash talked all the time. And then all of a sudden when something bad happens, it's like, well, oh, look at America with your big, strong muscles. Come on. Weren't you just calling me a misogynist clown 5 seconds ago that needs to, be more diplomatic and be more like you? And now that there's a threat, you want me to come in and take care of it? I think that's what he's addressing here. I want allies who actually take their own security seriously, take their participation in alliances seriously, dedicate the appropriate amount of funding, training, and militarization seriously so that they can actually be a real ally. Instead of one of these situations where it's like, oh yeah, we're your ally. We're going to go help fight this war that we've acknowledged is against a real enemy, and here's our battalion. Oh, so we send 10 divisions and you send a battalion, right? I think that's what he's getting at. Now, again, we could argue whether or not that could be clarified. But to your point, like if I was wording this, I might have gone back and said, okay, we do want to clarify that we understand we're responsible for our interests. You're responsible for your interests. Both of us are picking up the tab. And depending on the nature of a potential conflict that's going to take place, if it's your region,
I've been very critical of the amount of money that we give to Israel and Ukraine for years. But there are, and I'll actually take the case of Israel because they're always usually like, they're up there as the most controversial foreign policy flashpoint in the world, right? It's up there with like Kashmir with India and Pakistan, or right now with Ukraine and Russia. But in the case of Israel, here's an example of like a shared interest in a form of a shared enemy, at least in a specific case, is the Houthis attack shipping that impacts us, and the Houthis are allies with Hamas, who have obviously, killed a bunch of Israelis. By the way, Hamas has also killed Americans.
Yeah.
They're no friend of the United States at all. And so that's an example where, us firing back at the Houthis, that helps the Israelis. But I'm not saying that we need to be attacking the Houthis in the service of Israel. We have our own reason to be fighting against the Houthis. And insofar as Israel also has that same interest, I don't see any reason to not collaborate on that issue.
Why would we not cooperate with somebody that,
But I do think that that's different from all of the other critiques that we have with the amount of money that we send them. Same thing with Ukraine.
Sure.
And so the way that I would look at American first foreign policy, it goes back to some of David's earlier points about, what's in our interest. I do think it is in our interest to not allow the Houthis to block shipping through the Red Sea.
But specifically to this point, right? Because what this fourth point is insofar as you have an alliance, this is what you should look for in allies. This is what makes a good ally. I tend to agree with what he's saying here. I think this does make for a good ally, as someone that is, when we've agreed on a shared interest or a shared enemy, we are both willing in proportion to our ability to contribute, right? And I mean like real ability, not like, gosh, we'd love to spend more on the military, but we've got to fund this massive welfare state, right? We are willing to bear the burden of that alliance for our shared interest or against our shared enemy. And I do think that would be a fairly significant departure from what those alliances have looked like since after the Cold War. Is that fair?
I mean, with some nuance, again, I think that the biggest disagreement that I have is that I'm of the opinion that unless you're willing to fight somebody, they shouldn't be treated like an enemy. If you're willing to fight them, then yes, you can treat them like an enemy. They might need to be an enemy.
Sure. If you're willing, but this is not a question. If you go back to the third point, right, which is prioritization, right? It's about, look, we have limited resources, and not to mention the fact that part of the problem is that we've conducted ourselves in foreign policy like we don't have limited resources. And the end result is massive debt, inflationary monetary policy, war weariness on behalf of the American people, a feeling as if we've just wasted time and treasure and money and blood. Right? All of those things are consequences of not selectively recognizing limitations on resources and properly prioritizing. What he's saying here is that insofar as you offer an alliance, so a country may be an enemy. That doesn't mean you're looking to go to war for them. It does mean, though, that under the right conditions,
one could happen.
You're willing to fight, right? You're willing to fight. But if you have two nations which have diametrically opposed interests, even if they're not, again, we have diametrically opposed interests with Iran. That doesn't mean that we need to go invade Iran right now, but it does mean that you're probably headed for some sort of conflict along the way. There's going to be times when that intersects. So insofar as we have allies that also have problems with Iran, we should be looking at allies that are, again, insofar as we're going to come to the aid of our allies, we should expect our allies to come to the aid of us. Insofar as we're going to contribute to our allies' needs,
I definitely agree
they
with
should
that.
be able to contribute to us. I think that's the central point of what he's saying on this.
I definitely agree with that, and that's a good critique of the NATO system.
Yes.
Now NATO countries can point out that, well, we invoked, Article 5 after 9/11, and we called on NATO to help us after we were attacked. But I mean, look, when you look at it,
it was all big, right? The only country,
Denmark sent 10 guys to Afghanistan, right? It wasn't.
Yeah, the only country that, and look, if they would have said, look, I don't think this is worth it, right? Or I don't think this is good foreign policy to go to Iraq or whatever, I would have accepted that as, okay, hey, we disagree with you on this, right? But that's not what happened, right? It's like, oh yeah, we agree. Here's a medical unit that we'll send over for. I mean, that's not this.
One more point that I wish that David included in here, but he didn't, is that not every country in the world has to be an enemy or an ally.
Well, I think that's by definition. Because I think it's a bit of a totem, right? Not every country has to fall within one of those two categories. And again, this was meant to be what are the four principles upon which we build a more robust American first foreign policy. I actually love the idea of meticulously going through and looking at strategic interests, culture, a lot of other factors in order to determine what moves someone from being just friendly relations to maybe more hostile relations. You know, that's what most of your countries are going to fit within those two things. Hey, we're friendly, we do trade, whatever. Or, hey, no, not so much. We don't really jive. Versus, no, you are my ally and I'm willing to fight to defend you because I know you would do the same. Versus, you're my enemy and we're coming after you, right? Like that's the spectrum. And then what are the various criteria that would fall into that? That's a much broader conversation. But I do think these 4 principles are a decent starting place. The last thing we'll wrap up with is right now, American first foreign policy is a pendulum swinging sharply away from neoconservative excesses. These 4 principles provide the grounding we need to stop the swing before we reach the other extreme. We must remember that neoconservatism itself was a reaction to the excesses of the 1960s. It began as an admirable revolt against the Democrats' failure to recognize the moral and strategic stakes of the Cold War. But then victory birthed hubris. Correction became overreach. If we truly want to rectify prior errors, we must have the humility to not repeat past mistakes. I like what he says here because he's right in the sense that in the again, it's not all about not getting involved at all, because you remember how furious everyone was with Ronald Reagan, where he said it's an evil empire and my strategy is we win, they lose? It's like, you can't do that. That's ridiculous. You're encouraging World War III. No, he actually invoked moral courage to identify a regime that was evil and had the fortitude to be able to confront it. And lo and behold, was able to defeat it without invoking World War III or nuclear war. And so I appreciate that David brings this up, because there was this pendulum swing starting to manifest itself in the 1960s with détente and this idea that we're just going to have to accept the existence of the Soviets and the communist expansion, and we're just going to have to contain it as best we can. And Reagan was like, no, this is diametrically opposed to us. It's diametrically opposed to our interests, and we don't have to accept it. But I think it was the way he approached that was he did form strong alliances. And at that point, I do think the NATO alliance absolutely made perfect sense. And so I do think this is an important point that David's bringing up, is that pendulums tend to swing based off of being fed up with the status quo and the failure of the status quo. When in reality, what we should be doing is saying, look, most of these things are not happening for the overly simplistic reasons that people say, right? World War I did not exclusively happen because, they shot Archduke Ferdinand, right? That was a catalyst, but there was all these other conditions. So I think what David's saying here, and I think it's a really good starting point, is let's look at these conditions and let's be wise about the conditions. Let's be wise about the foreign policy. Let's come up with something that's consistent and that makes sense and is something that is sustainable, so that when catalysts pop up, we can distinguish between whether or not, okay, we see this thing happening and we know our inclination is we got to do that. Do we? Okay, let's go back and look at our principles. Let's go ahead and look at what we're trying to do and maintain. And then we're going to determine whether or not this catalyst is worth what everybody's screaming about in the moment.
Yeah, because everybody's tired of the war hawks.
Yeah.
And Trump is not a war hawk. He's kind of leading the way the other direction of, well, not completely, but using different methods and not just going, oh, well, here's how we sell this war to the American people. Yeah. Oh, look, we're going to find WND.
No,
whatever it is.
And he's, again, and I think so far what Trump has demonstrated actually with his foreign policy thus far is it's not isolationist. It's also not interventionist. It's like when you look at the things that he leverages in order to bring people to the table, it's not, we're just going to pick a side and then go with it. It's, we're going to try to go for peace. We're going to try to find something that stabilizes the situation, with the understanding that if you're really going to insist that one side has to get everything they want, then now you're committing to something significant. And maybe that's not the best solution. So he's willing to utilize American power, but he's also willing to utilize it in such a way which says, oh no, if you make us go to war with you, we're not coming and building everything up. We're just destroying your regime. And that is a much more intimidating threat in some capacity. So I think overall, I think Trump's instincts on a lot of foreign policy and foreign negotiation are very, very strong. I do think we need a coherent foreign policy to go with it, because again, it's not always going to be Trump in the negotiating table. And I would like us to have something coherent that Americans can expect. And I think this is a good starting point. Once again, thank you to everyone for joining us. Also, if you would like to be a member of our community, maybe chime in as we're having this and ask some questions, or maybe perhaps get some of our incredible mugs at Only Mugs, please consider joining our community and checking out the links in the description. Once again, go check out True Classic. Thank you again for joining us. We hope you found this informative and helpful and a good conversation, and we look forward to seeing you next episode.